Civilian Secretariat for the Police Service has now published a call for public comment on a draft amendment of the Firearms Control Bill. The bill attempts to remove the word self-defence as a valid reason to own a gun in South Africa. The police publishing the new change. Under the law, you would need to have a reason to have a gun, and that reason could not just be for self-defence. Well, let's speak to a representative of the gun-owning industry now. Martin Hood joins us. Martin, good afternoon to you. I imagine that you oppose the suggested change.
Stephen, we had been expecting these proposals. They surfaced originally in 2018. But the current proposals compared to the 2018 proposals are more radical, more restrictive, quite potentially more unconstitutional and more shocking than the industry expected.
I just want to go back a little bit. Okay, so before this amendment, so the law as it currently is, do you have to give a reason as to why you want a firearm license at the moment? Do you have to actually tick a box as to why you want a gun?
In certain instances, yes. If you look at a self-defense firearm, you've always had to provide need. You had to explain what your need was. Practically speaking, in respect of all other applications, the police have expected a motivation. And the application form even provides for space for submitting a motivation. But the practice has developed over the years that a more comprehensive written motivation would be provided with certain documents, certain formal documents such as proof of residence, your ID, proof of employment, testimonials. These have developed over the years as a practice where they were always submitted because it made the police's job easier in assessing an application. So the short answer is, yes, you've generally always had to provide a reason.
So would you have to provide a reason? I mean, could it just be the phrase self-defense, or could it be I own a shop and I transport a lot of cash on a Friday and therefore I need to have a gun for self-defense? I mean, would it have to be more detailed is what I mean?
It has to be more detailed because there's no definition of need. So, for example, owning a business would be a good reason. Opening and closing a premises, working irregular hours, travel. There's many different reasons, obviously, but generally the police want to see some sort of reason like that as an explanation. And I'll give a simple example of where they would not give a firearm license for self-defense. They would not generally give it to a university student because they don't have a need for a firearm, and also because campuses are declared gun-free. So that would be the type of explanation why the police would not give a license to a student. But they would give a firearm license to someone who was a key employee who opened and closed the premises at night and during the morning.
Okay, so now I understand, my understanding is that the firearms registry is, I'm looking for a polite word, in a mess. My understanding, therefore, is that it might be quite difficult for you to answer this question. Do we know how many people have legally said they need a gun for self-defense? And how many, in other words, how many people now are gun owners, and of a proportion of them, have actually ticked the box that we needed for self-defense and provided that motivation? Is it the vast majority, for example?
Well, I'm just in the process of submitting a request for access to information to answer that very question. And I don't know how accurate the Central Firearms Registry's records will be, if it will enable them to give us an answer. But I'm going to answer it in general terms, and that is, according to statistics that were published some years ago, about 50% of people who had licenses had them for self-defense. Now, I think it's reasonable in the circumstances to argue that more people would have obtained firearms for self-defense as a result of the deteriorating crime situation in this country. So I think it's fair to say that the majority of firearm owners own that firearm for self-defense.
Okay, so do you believe then that there's a bigger motivation here, that government is trying to limit the number of guns in our society? Are they trying to make it harder for people to own guns? Is that what is behind this amendment, do you believe, or proposed amendment?
I think it's most definitely political, and I want to make a statement, and I hope that members of South Africa's judiciary hear me when I say this. In recent times, there's been a number of court orders obtained against the police, specifically dealing with interpretation of and the functioning of the Central Firearms Registry. And many of these proposals propose ways to get around existing court orders. So in other words, the Civilian Secretariat of Police has deemed it appropriate to undermine the supremacy of our judicial system by wanting to pass laws that effectively negate court orders. That is a very, very concerning development.
Well, that, I mean, may be so, but in a democracy, a government does have the right to, and a democratically elected government at that, surely does have the right to try and determine the best policy that keeps the most people the safest they can be. In other words, the most safety there is for the highest number of people. Related to that will be conversations around gun ownership, not just here, but in many, many other countries. I mean, surely a democratically elected government has a right to look at what that policy would be, and if it comes to the conclusion, and if there's democratic support for it, that there should be limitations on gun ownership, let it be so.
Yes, I agree with that statement. What you're saying is there must be a rationale for any legislative proposal or amendment. And our position as the industry is quite simply that the rationale that appears to have been put forward is completely erroneous. And there is no rationale, and I just want to give a couple of examples. There is no rationale to limit or remove, in fact, self-defense firearms in an environment where the South African police services do not have the capacity to provide alternative protection to self-defense firearms. We need to remember as well that although the focus of the amendments and the focus of media attention has been on the right to self-defense, there are other very bizarre and equally worrying proposals, one of which is to limit the security industry's access to firearms. So we have a double blow here in that individuals' ability to protect themselves is going to be removed, and the security industry's ability to protect those individuals is also going to be severely limited. And there's no alternative. There is no provision that the South African police services will be able to carry out their constitutional mandate to properly protect us. We also have the environment where crime levels are increasing, and it's completely unrealistic and it's completely irrational to argue that in that environment to take away firearms is the appropriate step. So we have a situation where it's clear that this is not even policy driven, it's driven by agendas that are intent on taking away the right to protect oneself or the means to protect oneself, property as well. And I want to give some examples about property. These amendments don't only deal with the right to have a firearm for self-defense. With the stroke of an administrative pen, they propose to do away with the collecting of firearms. Now, we must remember that the collecting of firearms was created by the Firearms Control Act. Now, I'm a registered collector, and I have collectible firearms. Now, I jumped through the hoops created by the Firearms Control Act to become a collector. And having done that, I've settled down into being a certified collector. Now these proposals simply say, you can't be a collector. It's deleted from the Act. And the only thing that can happen to my firearms is that I must surrender those firearms for destruction. There's no transitional provisions relating to what I can do with those firearms. There will be no way that I can sell those firearms because every other collector is going to want to dispose of their firearms. So I did what the Act requires, and now because of an official's viewpoint about collecting, without consultation with the collecting fraternity, I might add, they've just decided at the stroke of a pen to delete my very collectible existence. That's the type of approach that we have to deal with by the Civilian Secretariat of Police. And I also want to emphasize for those who are watching and listening, we've been asking for years to actually have the opportunity to engage with these policymakers, to explain ourselves, to tell policymakers what the collecting of firearms is about, to engage them on their so-called research about why self-defense firearms should or should not be allowed. And the end result is that we get the set of proposals without any consultation with a very big part of the stakeholder community. That's very, very concerning.
Martin, I mean, obviously you'll know the argument around should people be allowed to own guns or not. It's very contentious, again, here and in other places in the United States. There's a lot of research that goes this way and that way, sometimes depending on who sponsors it. Some people and some of the research that I've seen suggests that perhaps it's actually not safer to own a gun. you obviously disagree with that. You would suggest that owning a gun does make you feel, it does actually make you physically safer.
Well, Stephen, I can speak from personal experience. Number one, as an attorney, I've experienced death threats on a number of occasions in the past, and not because of my work, but because of some of the people that I've been misfortunate to represent and so on. But having a firearm in those circumstances to me is very, very important. I must add that I'm actively involved in sports shooting as well, so I do know how to use a firearm properly. And I've also had the unfortunate experience of having to use a firearm to protect myself. And there are many, many, many thousands of other people who've had that unfortunate experience who may not be around to actually talk about it if they so wish, had they not had a firearm. So yes, I do very, very strongly believe that a firearm can be a useful tool to protect oneself. It's not a magic wand and it's not a panacea, but it certainly is a tool that can be used to protect oneself. And it comes with the responsibility that they must be stored and used in terms of the prevalent legislation and in a responsible manner. But what we have here is quite simply, by the stroke of an administrative pen, the deletion of the right to possess a firearm for self-defense that affects many, many people who've never put a step wrong in their lives, who've never contravened the legislation, the Firearms Control Act, never been convicted or even accused of an offence by anybody else. Yet, with the stroke of an administrative pen, they're effectively being told that you're no longer fit to have a firearm for self-defense. That's not right. That's not fair. And to answer your question, research, and particularly research done by Gun Free South Africa, where they made the allegation that you're 4 times more likely to have a firearm used against you than to use it successfully. They've had to retract that because their research was proven to be false. So when it comes to research, I'm sitting looking at a Harvard University study. Now, Harvard is an American university. It's a well-known one, and it's not a pro-gun establishment, but they've actually published an article recently where they said it's a myth to say that where there's more guns, there's more crime.
Martin Hood, I'm sure the debate will continue. I'm sure Gun Free SA will disagree with you if they're given a chance. Thank you very much indeed. Martin Hood is a spokesperson for the gun industry in South Africa and an attorney. In a moment,